Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
Honestly, where do you start, right? This election cycle did not go the way I think folks would have liked. I don't think it even went the way folks even anticipated. A close race of some sort, waiting days for results. We didn't even get that. And those of us who are left of center have some hard soul searching to do, and perhaps, I guess, a grieving process. We are fortunate enough, at least, that we have until January 20th, 2025, to catch our breath, to get our ducks in a row, to set up our posture for the next 4 years. But I'm not going to start this show by grieving for the Democratic Party or liberals, moderates, progressives, anyone left of center. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start by grieving for my country because I just don't get it. I don't understand. I really don't. And if they're allowed to teach this chapter in history years from now, I'm not sure historians or sociologists will get it. How we went from being a country progressing slowly towards more freedoms and not less to a society of growing understanding of differences to this. And I know the math. I know what the math is. I know that this is a slightly slim majority liberal country under the grip of minority rule. I know that the Constitution has its baked-in quirks that we assumably just have to continue living with. State lines drawn that give disproportionate power to the rural and thus conservative lifestyle. Gerrymandering at a 3-2 clip. 30 to 20 states usually. That's on average what conservatives hold in this country at the state level. Gerrymandering at that state level that gives disproportionate power, again, to the minority party in this country at the local, state, and federal level. All of which affects the Electoral College, which we again find ourselves gripped and watching and holding our breath to see what outcome that Electoral College will give us while paying no mind to the popular vote. And actually, it's on that note. I remember I saw this clip on Facebook a few days ago, and I put a pin in it and said, I'll get around to this at some point in time. I'd like to have this guy on my show. The Nation's justice correspondent is a fellow by the name of Elie Mystal. He's hard to miss. He's got high bleach hair. He's very outspoken. And I want you to listen to this conversation he had with the women from The View when it came to, well, what about the Constitution? Talk about its flaws and what can be done about it.
Let's talk about your new book. It's called Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Tell us about the book and why you wanted to write it.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do with this book is explain in layman's terms what Republicans are doing to the law. Because I honestly believe that if everybody understood it, they'd be as outraged as I am about it, and they'd be willing to do something about it. Mm-hmm. Look, folks, the law is complicated. I'm not going to lie about that. But it's not beyond the reach of most literate people, all right? It's not sending a rocket to Mars and making it land just so it doesn't right? You can read, you can understand the laws that govern this country, and you can understand how Republicans are obviously trying to manipulate those laws to take away the rights of minorities, women, the LGBTQ community. You can see it all, and I try to explain it all in ways that people can understand so that we can fight them.
I have to tell you, I loved this book so very much. The first chapter, canceling trash people is not a constitutional crisis. Chapter 9, the taking of black land, was another favorite of mine, and reverse racism is not not a thing. I just think it's fantastic.
So I live in Florida, so I'm like on ground zero of where all of this is happening. I'm out of my mind about the bills banning conversations about race and ethnicity and LGBTQ, just even mentioning gender identity in primary schools. But some will say, okay, so are you arguing for throwing out the Constitution? Should the Constitution be thrown out? What do we do? Is it a living document? Or is it a sacred document?
It's certainly not sacred. All right, let's start there. The Constitution is kind of trash. Now, let's just talk as adults for a second.
What did you say? It's what?
It's kind of trash.
Trash.
It was written by slavers and colonists and white people who were willing to make deals with slavers and colonists.
Right.
They didn't ask anybody who looked like me what they thought about the Constitution. They didn't say, oh, Jim, come over here. What do you think about this old Constitution? Well, massa, I sure don't like how you sell my children. But I gotta say, man, this King George, he needs to be stopped. My grandpapa used to say, ain't no taxation without representation for massa. Like, that's not what happened, right? This document was written without the consent of black and brown people in this country and without the consent of women in this country. Right. And I say if that is the starting point, the very least we can do is ignore what those slavers and colonists and misogynists thought and interpret the Constitution in a way that makes sense for our modern world. That's the starting line.
Do you want to rewrite it?
I could, right? I could rewrite parts of it in a tweet, right? Like, how about popular election for the president? People vote, not land.
That's not even in there, is it?
I'm saying if I was rewriting it, we could do it in a tweet, right?
Yeah.
You know?
Term limits for Supreme Court justices. And how about no states' rights when it comes to health care, elections, policing, and guns?
Right.
It's just better. That's just better, and you can do that in a tweet.
Can't the amendments help some of that?
Well, here's the problem with the amendment process.
Really fast now. I got 20 seconds.
The problem with the amendment process is that in American history, there have been 115 people allowed to interpret what the amendments mean. 108 of them have been white.
Okay.
That's a problem.
Well, you are certainly a compelling guest, I must say. Isn't it? Fantastic.
Yeah, and like seriously, that they only had one segment to me was blasphemous. I've reached out to him. I'd like to have him on my show at some point in time, and maybe we will. I mean, he's not wrong about a lot of that stuff, and he's absolutely right. A lot of what ails the Constitution, he could clear up in a tweet or a tweet thread. But I digress. That doesn't help us with what to do today and going forward, knowing that we are heading into a second, hopefully final, Donald Trump presidency. But again, I go back to my waking up this morning in America with a U, mourning the America that I knew. I grew up in the Ronald Reagan era, and obviously I was a child. I didn't really keep up with politics at the time, so I can't say I agreed or disagreed with Ronald Reagan or Tip O'Neill or the Democrats or Republicans. I just remember, and history shows, that the two parties obviously were acrimonial, but not to the point that there wasn't the possibility of bipartisanship. Things were getting done. There was actually conversations and rational, cogent, and humanitarian conversations about immigration. And we're to the point now where I try to rationalize with conservatives who are out of their minds about Central and South Americans coming to this country, out of this irrational fear that Democrats are just trying to harvest new voters. Okay, well, did yesterday not show you that Hispanic Americans, given the opportunity to vote in this country, are actually quite bipartisan? I've said this a lot. Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans, the Latino population is a mostly conservative subset of the human population. Many of them very tied to their Catholic faith. Very much pro-life, anti-abortion, anti-choice, whatever you want to call it. Who should be irrationally fearful of an immigrant coming into this country and becoming a U.S. citizen and voting any more than the party that professes to be pro-choice? And yet, the Democratic Party tries to be the party more welcoming, more empathetic, because we base our values, I believe, and I'm not religious. We base our values, I believe, more on actual Judeo-Christian tenets. We welcome the immigrant. We try and find shelter and food and clothing. We try to help the immigrant. We understand why the immigrant's coming here. It has nothing to do with just laziness or coming to steal Social Security checks, get our Medicare. Obviously, they actually contribute more to Medicare and Social Security than they ever get back out, knowing that they'll never get out of it what they put into it. Gracias, by the way. Back to Elie Mystal, who, by the way, tweeted this last night, and I thought it was pretty profound. He spoke of the Latino voter. Latino voters did not vote against their interest, he says. If you understand that the person who gets into a treehouse has an interest in pulling up the ladder behind them. Trump only promised to push the bad Latinos out of the tree, and they're confident that doesn't mean them. The Latino population is the second largest faction in this country, the largest minority. And I'm not saying that the Democratic Party has to stop paying attention to the interests of the African American voter. Obviously not. Democrats just need to figure out how to combat the immigration issue, for example, from a fact-based point of view. And you know, what is it Mark Twain said about a lie getting halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on? We barely identified the pants. What did I say a few days ago? I identified the Cato Institute's study that showed that actually more criminal immigrants came into this country under Donald Trump than under Joe Biden. And it's not even close. Like the next few months aren't going to change that. That gap will not change. That fact that more criminal immigrants came into the U.S. under Donald Trump than under Joe Biden, that fact will not change in the next few months. It's not even close. Did you hear that from anybody else? I realize the Cato Institute just released that here recently in the last week or so, but did you hear that anywhere else? What mainstream media outlet gave that to you? Certainly didn't see it in a campaign ad. Messaging is a big problem for the Democratic Party. It absolutely is. It's a messaging problem. People want to zero in on the whole masculinity thing. Maybe it's not macho, I guess, to be intellectual. Unfortunately, Democrats, liberals, we're burdened with being intellectual. Damn it. What a burden. And we live in a country, apparently, that doesn't have enough intellectuals voting. And, you know, I know we quip this, you know, hyperbolically on the left that, you know, that's what Republicans want. They want an uneducated populace. It's not true. They seem to benefit more from a base of voter that is less informed. How many studies have been done about Fox News viewers being less informed on issues than people who don't watch any news at all? I mean, that's hard to do, and yet the Fox News viewer, that data comes out all the time. And maybe this is something that we're on the ground floor here with this show, with America One Radio, with Progressive Voices, this show airing on both of those. Maybe this is the ground floor. Maybe this is the seed that needs to be planted. Because I also happen to think that one of the problems that we're dealing with in this country is a lack of a response to the decades old now. I mean, they've lapped us. They've long left the starting gate here. Once the fairness doctrine went away, the advent of talk radio and its pro-business, pro-conservative bias quickly enveloped the talk radio scene. It brought us Fox News. There hasn't really been a proper response, a buildup of a liberal response to that. A friend of mine tweeted about this last night. I'll share it with you in just a few minutes. The Ron Show on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. Now more than ever, I need you to follow along, to keep up, to join in. This is going to have to be a movement, and it's going to have to be a consistent movement, one that spans not weeks, months, an election cycle, but perhaps decades, if I've got decades still within me. I'm a 50-year-old man, but I am Ron Roberts, host of The Ron Show here at America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. You can follow the show at Ron Show ATL, Twitter X, and I'm not leaving that, Instagram, Threads, Facebook. RonShowATL.com is the website for past episodes and show notes. Friend of the show, he's been on a couple times. His name is King Williams. He's a bright young man, journalist based in Atlanta, Georgia. Last night, something he tweeted to me just spoke to me and told me, like literally told me in my head, this is you. He's talking about you. He's talking about you and those like you who need to do a better job of cobbling together what King Williams says this country's missing. He tweets, takeaway. Number 1, there is no liberal media ecosystem, but they need one. He then goes on to speak of the history of the uprising of conservative media. Started against FDR and concurrently white Southerners who were against national media coverage during the Civil Rights Movement and confuses educated workforce with liberalism. Number 2, he writes, narratives matter. The economy is doing well, and we have the world's best post-COVID return. Core inflation and consumer prices are falling, but constant complaints of prices, not focusing on price gouging, companies and shareholders, even as political theater, didn't happen. I'm going to disagree with him on that. I actually thought much of the conversation about price gouging and profits and shareholders, I think that was actually a lot of focus, specifically from the Kamala Harris presidential campaign, but I don't think it was enough of it. And I'll dive in on what I thought there was too much focus on and not enough focus on a little bit later in the show, but let me continue on here. So everyday people alongside Republicans on the campaign trail, plus conservative media, harping on prices, keeps the narrative that it's still inflation and it's still a tough economy, even when data says something different. We shared audio from Bill Maher's new rule that basically spelled that out. The economy is actually great, much better than the rest of the world. Hell, that's one of the most frustrating things about last night's outcome, honestly. We just finally got back to a point where we were at pre-COVID norms. We have fixed all of the ills economically that had to be navigated through in a post-pandemic global economy. Well, Trump will inherit that. He'll credit that. And I believe he's going to wreck it. And Elon Musk said so. I'll dive into that a little bit later as well. Let me continue with King Williams here. Number 3. A lot of people really don't like the LGBTQI community, and using transgender people as a wedge issue in their culture war attacks really worked. Yes. Then slowly moving to chip away at perception of gay people by separating conservative gays versus liberal gays in their media. Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'd said that before. They were trying to pull the LGP away from the QTIA+. Not sure it really was all that effective, but they sure enough tried. And I do believe that they moved enough voters who are friendly with the gays, but don't know any trans people. King Williams continues, we've all seen those transgender ads ad nauseum, but you know what else has been on the rise? Anti-gay propaganda. Then using fear-mongering of child trafficking, endangerment, indoctrination, and grooming. That's a deliberate attack at a steadfast base for the Democrats, and it worked. King tweets number 4, the religious right is stronger than ever, and they're going to really mess everything and everyone up. That's sobering. He boils it down into TLDR. Too long, didn't read. The religious right coalesced in the 1970s from varying religious groups in the U.S. after several successful anti-discrimination wins, desegregation and civil rights, women's rights movements of the 1950s through 70s. Abortion wasn't even an issue until the late 1980s. So all that talk about evangelicals is for the most part the dominant theology and cultural reference point for all subgroups, Catholicism and Protestantism. And they all are anti-gay and anti-abortion. They are also the easiest voters to rile up and control. Sorry, not sorry, he says. Number 5, he kind of brings it home here. All of these groups consume lots of conservative media. They have a different worldview because they have a different media diet. It's taken almost 50 years, but we're in the golden age of conservative media, and now with the global scale of the internet and money from all types of people. Skipping ahead a tweet or two, he writes, newspapers, think tanks, magazines, television programs, talk radio, all coalesced in the 1970s. Got bigger in the 80s because Reagan's deregulation and ending the fairness doctrine. Their deregulation was actually under Clinton, but pushed by conservatives, so there's that. Leading to actual partisan news, which conservatives start harping on liberal media. And Reagan changed the rules on ownership for his friend Rupert Murdoch, who started Fox Broadcasting in the 1980s and was already successful in destroying the media ecosystem of Australia and the UK before. So much of what is conservative media is a remix of his own ideas and work. By the 1990s, we have what King Williams writes, a bunch of things. Most Southern Dems are finally all shifted to Republicans. Suburban Atlanta's Newt Gingrich becomes the archetype for a new conservative culture warrior in the U.S. House, while suburban Atlanta guy was on the radio airwaves in Sean Hannity. And fast forward 25 more years, and all of conservative media and political figures are just copies of these guys, but with social media channels and YouTube accounts. But you know what didn't happen? What didn't take off? Actual liberal media. Absolutely. We'll continue that conversation when we pick up. Got a hard break here. The Ron Show on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast.
Broadcasting 5 days a week to make common sense common again. This is The Ron Show on America One Radio.
All right, joining me to discuss the thread that I just dove right on into this morning in the aftermath of yesterday's political outcomes, King Williams, who you can find on Substack, The Breakdown with King Williams. Thanks for joining the show, man. How are you doing this morning?
I'm gonna be honest with you, not great.
Yeah, it's a tough day to wake up, no doubt about it. And I tried to tell myself, get out of bed, Ron. Don't throw a best of up. And it was all I could do to set myself up. And I even woke up yesterday, got my show done. I had nothing else to do, and I really didn't want to sit around and watch cable news all day and be anxiety riddled. So I got in the vehicle and I drove down to New Orleans. I'm hanging out with my buddy Daryl. He had an election watch party last night he'd been so excited about. So I came down to be a part of that, only to, again, feel like I did similarly 8 years ago in 2016. I want to pick up on your Twitter thread here because I think you make a valid point that not a lot of folks talk about, and there's always that fear of pushback from the right. Well, you have the liberal media. Your Twitter thread, which we were talking about in the last segment, and I'll share it in the show notes at ronshowatl.com, speaks to the fact that there really is no left-wing version of all that has been built up over the last, 5 or 6 decades to form a conservative media apparatus. When did this epiphany occur to you? Is it something that's been sort of bubbling under, inside that head of yours for a while?
I'm not even gonna say I haven't had this epiphany for a while. I will say it's actually based on another academic scholar. I think she's off of Twitter for good reason. Her name is Nicole Hemmer. She has a book called Messengers of the Right, in which she specifically focuses on the role of conservative media over the last 50 years between 68 through 2018. But I think her work is really informative. There's another woman by the name of Leah Wright Rigueur, who also has a book called The Loneliness of the Black Republican. And on its surface, those two books they have a little bit of an overlap, but they have a lot more because it relates to media and class and race and tokenism in ways I think that those two complement each other almost as like two sides of a different coin. And so that's where I'm drawing that from. But also just in general, that epiphany actually came from their work, but also specifically around the time of 2011, 2012. And I know that's early from probably your listeners are thinking about, but it really came when somebody was, there was a girl I knew in New York, and she was telling me about this thing called podcast. I didn't know what podcast was. I was introduced to the world of podcasts through her. And when I first got initially introduced to it, it was like a lot of these kind of comedy dudes, and I didn't think they were funny. But I noticed at that point just the number of people who I knew at that point were conservative, kind of talking points, just because I knew a lot of the previous work of other people and things like that. And I was like, oh, that's weird. I was like, why is a Rush Limbaugh, Neil Bortz kind of thing on a podcast? But it made sense. Okay, they do talk radio. You can just take the audio over. I didn't think anything about it. But it really wasn't until around 2018, 2019 when I started seeing the rise of people like Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro and things like that.
Joe
and just
Rogan.
Not even Rogan. And I have my own reason why I didn't notice Rogan as that first. But I noticed how much people, and this is going to sound really offensive, but people I knew had a lot of opinions but didn't do a lot of rigorous research or reading would be really into those two types of people and those types of podcasts.
Yeah.
And then the Joe Rogan thing really blew up for me because I didn't take Joe Rogan serious. I kept seeing his podcast always pop up in like the podcast player in Apple, but I was just like, whatever. It looks kind of just broy, kind of lame. It's 4 hours. I don't want to hear my friend talk for 4 hours.
Yeah.
So I didn't listen to it. So, but it wasn't until he got that Spotify deal in early 2020. Well, 2020 wasn't early, but it was that year 2020. All the things were going on, but I was like, they gave Joe Rogan $100 million deal. And that's what made me really start to think about like, okay, what's going on here, and why is this guy worth $100 million, and now he's got a $250 million deal with Spotify, and that's kind of what really got me thinking heavily about conservative myth. And people like Joe Rogan, who prior to this election weren't directly conservative, but they kind of like conservative adjacent. And I think that's really how you want to think about this. Like conservative adjacent people are actually the gateway, and not necessarily like your Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens is a Joe Rogan or someone like the YouTube reactors and things like that, who actually bring you in. Then eventually you get into like the heavier Ben Shapiro, weird Elon Musk, Thomas Sowell kind of shit. I mean stuff. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Hey, this is a podcast too, so you.
Okay, so I'm sorry about that.
You know, it's just ironic that you mentioned this. You know, I when I started this show 2 years ago, I did it obviously because I'm politically motivated, no doubt about it. I have my views. I'm left of center. I believe that there is a dearth. I thought more on the talk radio vantage point, but that's showing my age. I'm 50 years old, and so I know that talk radio has never really had much of a presence from the center left, and you know that'll continue on because radio is a dying medium for an older generation. But I never really thought about podcasting also being center right, but yeah, I mean, it kind of is. And so having, one online radio station said, yeah, you can have some time. And then another one came around and said, yeah, we'd like to give you some time as well. And so, you know, the show has grown in that realm, and the podcast numbers are what they are. I never really thought about from the podcast sphere that we're actually dealing from a deficit as well, but we absolutely are. And what I don't understand is, and maybe this is the ground floor. Maybe this, this and Stephanie Miller and some other folks who are out there kind of cobbling together this loose network, this loose assemblage of boats trying to come together to form a fleet. We're just kind of at the infancy of this. I don't know if it'll ever come to be. I don't think that there are deep enough pockets to put something together. We tried this with talk radio, I believe in the 1990s or early 2000s. It's where Rachel Maddow was basically discovered on the America One? Was it America One or One America?
Yeah.
So, but they also had Jerry Springer on it. So, I mean, who's going to take that seriously? And before he was a senator, I'm trying to remember the guy from Saturday Night Live, who ascended to the Senate. He was also on that network as well. But we're dealing with a deficit. So is there some way? Are there pockets deep enough? Is there a liberal with money that's going to say, you know what, I don't care how much it costs. This apparatus needs to come together.
You know what? I know that sounds crazy. The answer is yes, but it's probably going to come from like a non-traditional place. I know we're in Atlanta, me and you, but Bernie Marcus, like one of the co-founders of Home Depot, him and Arthur Blank are on two diametrically opposed ends. But if you look at what Bernie Marcus has done with his donations, really being a hard right conservative, in a lot of cases, both like anti in general, and definitely on like the anti-gay, anti-black, whatever kind of spectrum and liberal spectrum. He donated a lot. He was definitely one of the people behind the scenes putting a lot of money, offering his foundation, their venues, and like his institutional support for a lot of these conservative organizations, from PragerU to Charlie Kirk to Turning Point USA. I think if it was somebody like Arthur Blank, somebody who has a business that's tied into a real cash flow, like that, and who's older, who just like Arthur Blank, I think he put in some sizable money for Kamala Harris. Bill Gates for sure did. I do think is a version of that, but they would have to be like, Bill Gates is one of the reasons why we have MSNBC to this day. So like, I think people forget that. So I do think, to your point, I think there are people to do it, but it would have to be two things. One, had to be a sizable donation. Two, it would have to be smaller, so smaller level of players. And three, it would have to be almost video focused first. And I know that sounds crazy than audio, because we're talking on an audio podcast now, but when you look at the number of Gen Zers, men and women, who have been indoctrinated with some form of conservative content, and I mean conservative content as these are not people who like Theo Vaughn, who's a conservative who has opinions or like that the other white dude who's like conservative, but he does like the listen on TikTok. He has like the random facts, Justin Dangerly. Like all those, your niece or your nephew who's getting their interfacing for with TikTok and YouTube is like their primary means in all forms of like knowledge or lack thereof. What I will say the PragerU's, Turner Point USA, and Candace Owens have done is they have their podcasts or video. They cut them up into small pieces across all those platforms, but they also have secondary people, content creators that they jump on their shows, people who do reaction channels, people who do essays and take down videos. And that is a large part of the internet, whether your niece or your nephew wants it, right? So I think that if there is a liberal version of that, it would have to be one, addressing what that current marketplace is, of the things that I just mentioned. And then two, for people who are a little older like me and you, like I'm a millennial, I think you're a Gen Xer, making sure that you have consistent content for them, because that's also how they start to really interact with the world. MSNBC is fine, but what I think MSNBC made a real bad mistake on was they kind of overinvested right before Trump. So like, let's say later Obama years with just stars and being on prime time. And I think they actually should have been like heavy on like, this is what podcasts are. And the podcast should not personalities are fine, but the podcast should actually be topical. I think the More Perfect Union guys have kind of figured that out in the video space, which I don't know if you've ever but they are a liberal thing. They're not leftist, they're liberal. And I think that one thing that they have been doing is you look at like some of the demographics, like the women in like conservative states who wanted to codify Roe versus Wade, like Florida, Nebraska, and Missouri. But you also look at how they vote on things. And like the More Perfect Union guys kind of understand that dynamic and that audience. And they make a lot of videos for people who are like socially conservative and maybe actually politically liberal, but they just don't know it yet, right? And I think that that's who you actually want to invest in. Like, how can you make more versions of that? Like, and how do you grow out something like a More Perfect Union where you can tell people, okay, these are the policies that you want. You want Trump because you want a strongman at lower prices, but we're gonna like More Perfect Union. I know this because they've done probably like 2024 like 50 videos on price gouging. And so the number of young people I've seen interact with that, they kind of now understand what price gouging is, what company does what, and they'll take it one by one. This company did this company did that, and just do it for that audience. And I think that actually is the way to go. It needs to be more topical and consistent. And then for the older consumers of that liberal media, it needs to be more personality driven. Younger, it's got to be topical, and older, it's got to be more person driven.
Yeah, and you know, when I come back to MSNBC, I keep thinking of the faces of MSNBC, and you know, I thought, first of all, big mistake. I wouldn't put all my chips in on folks like Al Sharpton. I think the world of Chris Hayes, but I just don't. I mean, he's not TikTok worthy. You know, he's not marketable. He's not hip. He's not somebody that. You know, Ari Melber makes me cringe every time he tries to drum up some hip hop reference because he's Ari freaking Melber, dude. Come on, stop. It's not selling with me. I adore Rachel Maddow, but Rachel Maddow is she's kind of a stalwart now. It's not necessarily going to connect with a younger demographic, and beyond that, the bench is pretty thin, I think. I think of the young lady, her name eludes me, but the politics girl. I think she's fantastic on TikTok, and I've seen her a lot on Newsnight with Abby Phillip. I think she is fantastic and engaging, and I need to see more of that, on the dais and at the round table when these conversations are being had.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the other thing is too, to your point, there is somebody, he's a leftist or a leftist, and I think like actually directionally, he's also somebody, I think he's not going to do necessarily liberal media because, leftists hate liberals more than they hate conservatives and Republicans.
Right.
But that's a whole nother conversation. But there's a guy named FD Signifier, and so he makes a lot of videos from a formerly leftist, like full-on leftist perspective. Like a lot of people, he was like a traditional black steadfast Democrat, then became more critical, then became into leftist movements, and then left out of that for different reasons. And I think that what he is, it's not just that he does essay videos and reaction videos. What he also does, he directly goes against some of like the online content creators, people who make videos for him, against him. And like I say that because the leftist YouTube space is so fraught with like just purity battles of who does what, who doesn't do what, or what's the best way, that it doesn't get anything going. And oftentimes like leftist YouTube just kind of like eats itself and never grows and gains. But FD Signifier is the one person in general, like your average conservative content creator is typically like, all right, I gotta really fire off on this one, because when he makes a video about something, it generates enough to where like those curious dudes, like especially like he makes videos for dudes who were Trump curious but didn't vote. But he keeps them off the ledge of that. And I think that is actually like the person you probably want to figure out if you can't do anything directly with him, but like, how do we find somebody else who's in that vein? I know I say this because he's done over 2023 and 2024, a couple of videos of More Perfect Union, just a standard liberal, actual piece of liberal media in the digital space. But I think that actually is the blueprint, like Politics Girl, FD Signifier, for different reasons. FD Signifier is going to directly go at like those people who say wild stuff and like are directionally wrong, and like just to their face immediately, not to their like literal face, but to their digital face, and go do it directly. Politics Girl, because hers I think is a little bit more palpable, it's more approachable. Those are two things you need. And there's a third aspect I think of liberal like content creators, which is the one that I think that doesn't exist right now, really, but I think it should be going forward, which is lifestyle. So like the trad wife girls in particular, like they have the trad wife girls, the soft life girls are a version, and a lot of the trad wife girls are just straight up like evangelicals or Mormons or something like that. And that's a different type of social and religious conservatism alongside political ones. But you see what they've done the last 2 years, getting so many girls who like really were considering being career women, being auspicious, and they get that first 1 or 2 hits in life, and they're just like, all right, cool, I want to stop and be a stay-at-home wife. They've been so successful because their version of conservatism isn't like straight ahead noxiousness. It actually is a very different thing. It's more soft pedal propaganda. And I hate to say this, but like liberals got to figure out what that version of that looks like, right? Because I think that the soft wife girlies, and also there's a decent amount of like also dudes on YouTube who do like I'm gonna fix my car, I'm gonna fix this house kind of thing, and like they're also very much in that conservative kind of space. There's no liberal version like, oh, okay. And that's not saying, let's go fix.
I think you're right. You're right. Listen, I'm going to take a quick break and come back. We're going to catch up and wrap this conversation. We're with King Williams. You can find him on Substack, The Breakdown with King Williams, talking about the lack of there being a liberal media bubble to answer the conservative media bubble. When the Ron Show returns here on America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. Final segment of the Ron Show, and what is going to be the first day of many tough days for the next, 1,400 days as we endure another 4-year Trump presidency. I'm on with King Williams. You can find him on Substack, The Breakdown with King Williams, Atlanta area journalist, documentarian. Why do you think it is so hard for facts to permeate in this media genre that we're sitting in right now? I was trying like crazy in the last few days to point to a Cato Institute study that showed, for example, that more known criminal immigrants came into the U.S. under Donald Trump than under President Biden. And I didn't hear that coming out of the Kamala Harris campaign or Kamala HQ on Twitter X or any of that. I'm the one guy who said it. I don't know who else covered that story. It should have been, top of the full New York Times headlines, and yet nobody covered it. Or how, we're looking at an economy that's actually in great shape, comparable to where it was, and how Trump inherited a great economy and wrecked it. When do facts actually cut through the bullshit?
Okay, I have 3 answers. 1 is confirmation bias. 2 is conservative media is about a worldview, and I think liberals don't understand that. Like, the things that you're saying are directionally true, are factually true, are contextually true. It doesn't matter in conservative media because the goal is I have to have this narrative, and the narrative and the worldview that's shaped by this narrative is the thing that trumps all else. It does not matter. And the third thing, the most important thing, is when you mentioned earlier, why didn't the New York Times cover this? I think liberals make the one suggestion that conservatives haven't, which is they make the mistake rather. Liberals look for institutions for validation and amplification. Conservatives do that on their own. And when there are institutions that aren't within their purview, they try to take it over and discredit it and then take it back over. So I say that because like the New York Times in particular is the United States of America's paper of record since the 1800s. Right. They are meant to cover important major national events for the United States as a fact of historical record. The time since the 1960s and the 70s, and even before they had other times where conservatives of both parties, of social conservatives, would say, you didn't cover the story the way I wanted to, give me an op-ed. No? Okay, we'll write one in the National Review, or we'll write one in these other publications until We'll make us think about it. We'll get on local news. We'll try to get people until you give us that space in the op-ed, and then I want to see real articles. That's something that they do to this day. Like, that strategy has not changed in 60 years. What they also do is after they criticize the organization, what they do is they try to find people who have ideological viewpoints and get on it. So there was like a person who was formerly on Breitbart, like, which is a real far-right conservative outlet. A couple of years ago during the Trump administration, who got a position with the Washington Post. And so then you look at also like what's going on with CNN, what's going on with the Washington Post again now in 2024. A lot of these people are conservatives. They come up through the traditional media ecosystems. Then they try to like reaffirm that viewpoint through the traditional media ecosystems that exist, while other ones from the outside are also doing their own thing. So you can see this sometimes in real time. If you watch, like, pay attention to some of the Breitbart actual message board stuff. So a lot of stuff about like immigrants or rhetoric about that, rhetoric about abortion, and now like all the Breitbart clones, they will eventually get some story that actually is a bit true or has some real truth in it, massage, and you'll see it work up in real time until it gets to the Wall Street Journal, or it gets to Newsweek, or it gets to some of these other papers, and then it becomes like this national story that's getting all this coverage in traditional media, but it's already been bubbling the last 3 to 6 months in conservative outlets. And now with the role of social media and Instagram, it might have been bubbling for 6 to 12 months online before it gets. Now you have a whole group of people, they've ingested multiple forms of content of that, and I hate saying that word, but multiple forms of content, multiple forms of viewpoints and images about these topics. And so now it's like, oh, the Times is just coming, the mainstream media, is finally covered the story that we've seen before. It wasn't even a story before. It was somebody lied for 6 months, and then somebody found one factual thing and then picked up on it, right? And we're seeing that now. The only difference is now it's not even 6 months, it's 3 months. So a lot of the things that people have seen, like a lot of unfortunate stuff I've seen for like a lot of my LGBT homies, like that's just not true, or that people making up stuff about the drag brunches, or people photoshopping stuff that wasn't there.
Oh my God.
Or just, it's like that was bubbling. Somebody did that on Twitter or on Reddit or something like that. Just read something, and now in 6 to 8 weeks, it's a real topic on Fox News, and then 4 weeks after that, it's in the opinion section of the Times, and then 4 weeks after that, your mama's asking you, why are drag queens like indoctrinating kids in the 3rd grade? Like, it's like stuff like that, and that's something that the liberals don't have a grasp on. Like, you've got to understand that that's how the game is played.
But I also didn't see any response from the Harris campaign, and I know they try to do the they go low, we go high mantra, but they didn't answer to the anti-trans TV commercials that just permeated sporting events, and I think it had an impact. The response is pretty simple. Federal law dictates that we have to provide, health care to folks who are in our federal prisons. It has nothing to do with them being trans, or them being overweight, or them being type 2 diabetic, or having a foot ailment, or gout, or any of those issues. That's federal law. It has nothing to do with somebody's, gender preference or gender identity. That's just the law. We follow the law. There was no response to that. There was no response to Kamala being the border czar, and what Kamala actually was, and Kamala's actual effectiveness on the 3 nations that she was charged with limiting, finding root causation for the migration, or how that we're actually to blame for a lot of the root migration that's coming to this. This is something that the party and their candidates and their apparatus and the development, I guess, of a liberal media ecosystem need to work on. That's just my 2 cents. And, if I'm just one of the few voices that are actually doing it, and I'm trying this 5 days a week, God bless, we need to find some more. King Williams, I want to thank you for giving me some time today. It's a tough day for any of us to even have a conversation with any spirit or any motivation. And I appreciate the fact that you even, grabbed the invitation and said, yeah, I've got some time for you. I appreciate that. You can find King Williams at The Breakdown with King Williams on Substack. Listen, man, today's another day. The sun rose. We'll see this through.
All right. Thanks, man.
All right. Our conversation went long, but I thought it was pretty necessary. And King taught us a lot of stuff, dropped a lot of names. So I'm going to have to go back and fast forward and rewind and write down some of these names myself, some authors and some content creators to follow. And hopefully you will as well. By the way, feel free to add this as one of them, at Rancho ATL. Whether it's on Facebook, Twitter, X, Instagram, Threads, of course, on your preferred podcast platforms as well, if you're listening on America One Radio or Progressive Voices via TuneIn. This show does air Monday through Friday, 9 to 10 a.m., 5 to 6 p.m. on America One, and 11 p.m. to midnight at Progressive Voices, and a weekend edition that I believe airs 10 a.m. Saturdays and Sundays on Progressive Voices via TuneIn. Show notes at ranchoatl.com. It's day one. We've got a few more of these to go through, so let's do it together. Thank you for listening to Ron Show. We'll catch you tomorrow.